A stranger helped me pick up the files my boss threw at my face in the parking lot. He didn't say much. He simply crouched, gathered the scattered pages, and stacked them with a care that made the action look deliberate rather than accidental, while my boss shouted that I was worthless. I remember the folder returning to me like a small, fragile archive of the life I'd been building for 9 years. I remember the man standing, nodding once, and walking away without explanation. 3 days later, I was called to the executive floor. I expected a dismissal. Instead, that same stranger sat at the head of the table in a suit that fit like authority. My boss stood beside him, hand trembling, color gone from his face. The man who had helped me pick up those papers was the new CEO conducting unannounced site visits. The truth had been seen. The truth would not be ignored. My name is Catherine Smith. For nearly a decade, I kept Meridian Systems client relationships alive and orderly. I explained problems simply and fixed them quickly. I tracked promises and reconciled expectations. I worked in the margins where most managers didn't want to go. The unresolved tickets, the awkward emails, the deadlines that required someone to stay late and clean up the mess no one wanted to own. In those 9 years, I built a reputation based on predictability. People trusted me because I returned calls and because I made certain things stopped breaking. I liked the work because it was measurable. I liked that results could be pointed to and audited. What I didn't know was that precision will only keep you safe until someone decides they prefer performance over product. Alex Carter arrived like a new showrunner at a long-running series. He was polished, articulate, and practiced in the art of visibility. In meetings, he spoke in phrases that landed like applause lines. He presented ideas in bold slides and wore leadership as if it were a costume tailored to command attention. When the board smiled, he took the room's breath as proof that charisma equals competence. He did not build. He curated. He took the contours of our work and reframed them as his own strategic interventions. Where I saw the work and its seams, he saw optics and credits. He took credit the way a skilled editor rewrites a manuscript and changes the author's name. He would enter a room, listen superficially, then present a version that made the process look tidy and his role unavoidable. Once, after I designed a tracking template that reduced handoffs to one clear checklist, he rebranded it in a town hall presentation as a leadership initiative. The slides bore his name at the bottom. The applause followed. I sat through the meeting with a printed copy of the original version on my lap, while he received praise for executing the only thing my team had built. That was the start, small thefts, then larger ones. He rewired the social architecture of the team. People who had once collaborated now guarded information. He preferred power concentrated in the center, where he could perform it. When he criticized, it was surgical. A comment about someone's presentation energy here, a note about strategic perspective there. The language sounded like coaching, but translated into practice, it became an eraser. Colleagues who opposed his narrative found themselves removed from key threads, excluded from later drafts, reassigned to peripheral projects. It wasn't brutal in a single blazing event. It was steady attrition. Fear accrued like interest. He used the review cycle as a weapon. Performance reviews, once administrative, became public displays where minute failures were magnified. He would hold weekly reviews as if they were hearings. He expected contrite answers and crisp accountability. The junior analyst who asked for a clarification in a meeting discovered his correction later recirculated as insubordination. A mid-level manager who questioned an unrealistic timeline was suddenly absent from the next leadership call, reassigned to a technical role with less visibility. The pattern was clear. Assertiveness was punished. Compliance was rewarded. People learned to breathe the air of caution. The team's calendar filled with rehearsed updates and tidy dashboards rather than messy, honest conversations. I adapted the only way available. I documented. My inbox, once a tool, became a ledger. Drafts were archived with notes. Versions were time-stamped and moved to a private folder. I saved threads I thought unnecessary. I photographed whiteboards when discussions took an unexpected detour. The act of collecting evidence felt like building an insurance policy. It was not dramatic. It was methodical. I did not plan revenge. I built proof. The company announced a merger. The internal note was clinical and brief. Integration, synergy, leadership changes. Buried in a line was the name Michael Reeves as incoming CEO. No photo, no voice memo, no fanfare. Rumor committees convened in the background like static. Whispers said he liked to walk the floors unannounced. Others said he reviewed culture by watching how people acted when they thought no one of consequence was there to see them. Those words circulated but did not land. Rumor is an unreliable map. It is only useful if someone decides to follow it. None of us expected him at our corner of the building that day. The escalation began over a client renewal. It was the kind of account that requires constant tending and a long memory. The relationship existed because someone answered the call at 3 a.m. more than once. I had been that someone. The renewal process required dozens of moving parts. Legal approvals, system reconciliations, client signatures, delivery guarantees. Alex sliced himself into the process with a broadcast email. He would lead the final discussion. Leadership, in his language, always meant a public gesture. He promised an accelerated schedule to impress the new leadership. It was a lie dressed as ambition. When compliance flagged missing clauses, he blamed legal for being slow. I fixed the inconsistencies to keep the client satisfied. I updated the system, sent corrected versions, and replied to the client thanking them for their patience. I copied Alex. He read it as betrayal. From that moment, his behavior shifted. He began to edge me out of communications, to sanitize threads I had written, to circulate clarifications under his name. He edited my language and used the edits later as evidence that I had been imprecise. The team responded to his cues. People stopped coming forward with concerns. Questions went to him first. The social web shrank to the size of his approval. Meetings moved from collaborative centers to theater. He thrived in that environment. He could now perform as the rescuer of complex realities he had not created. I kept building my record. I created an audit trail that traced deliverables to timestamps, emails to edits, approvals to user sessions. The more I assembled, the more obvious the pattern became. Credit siphoned upward, responsibility withheld, dissent neutralized. I did not confront him. I did not go to HR immediately. Confrontation in a room where optics mattered risked being labeled emotional and unprofessional. I chose instead the slow escalation of evidence. The erosion of trust was visible in small rituals. People arrived later to avoid early stand-ups. They used ambiguous calendar titles to hide the substance of meetings from him. They walked out of review sessions holding their phones in their hands, as if recording a conversation that might later be needed as proof. I watched colleagues grow thinner around the edges, quiet, guarded, efficient. Fear became a professional ethic in the department. When Alex moved from appropriation to humiliation, his strategy was clear. If control couldn't be achieved through co-option, make the target small. Public humiliation creates an audience that polices itself. That Friday was engineered with the same logic. He called me out of the building, a printed report in his hand, energy practiced for spectacle. He spoke in a voice designed to echo, to drag attention across the parking lot where people lingered to the cars. He accused me of incompetence in front of them. He tore the folder from my grasp and threw pages into the wind. Paper, once a record of work, became props in a scene meant to ostracize. I remember kneeling in the rain and picking up the pages, aligning numbers that no longer wanted to stay in order. I remember the way a crowd can look away, How professional colleagues clean their hands of awkwardness when social cost is the bottom line. Then a pair of hands joined mine. They moved with the calmness of someone who believed the work mattered more than the drama. A man in a dark overcoat arranged the papers, matched torn margins, and handed the folder back. He nodded, and with that small gesture, his observation closed the circuit between humiliation and accountability. At the time, I did not know his name or his rank. I only knew that someone had witnessed what I feared would vanish into the company's normalcy. I did not ask him to stay. I should have. I watched him leave, and I sat in my car, the folder on the passenger seat like an artifact of a life being dismantled. I was exhausted and furious and private in a way that left no room for performance. Monday morning, the story had run the building's rumour channels. People who had been present referred to the incident as if it were a weather event. Unpleasant, observed, then moved past. He kept his mask on in meetings, smiled in a way that suggested nothing had happened. He made a game of normalcy. That is the dangerous thing about orchestrated humiliation. It invites complicity by giving others a way out, distance and silence. Then the email arrived. Executive review, attendance required. The subject line felt like a sentence without verbs. The 18th floor had a different code. It smelled of polish and was quiet in a way that erased small talk. I rode the elevator with colleagues who looked like they carried their names on their chests, nervous and steady at once. When I entered the glass conference room, the man from the parking lot sat at the head of the table. The nameplate in front of him read, Michael Reeves, Chief Executive Officer. The fact of his presence was a clean administrative act, a new figure in the chain of command. The fact that he had crouched beside me in the parking lot 3 days before changed everything. The HR director opened the session with the language of policy and procedure. They referenced security footage that captured the sequence of events in the lot. They read witness statements that had been collected with discretion and rigor. The CEO did not react with melodrama or performative anger. He listened while the record unfolded, like someone examining a machine with a clear intent to know which parts had failed. There was no theatrical firing, only the kind of administrative gravity that makes text irreversible. He signed the dismissal documents. By noon, Alex's access was revoked. The downfall was not a spectacle, it was an erasure. Years of curated visibility reduced to an HR file, a row of empty chairs in a team meeting, the corporate systems identifying where authority would no longer root. He left in a way I half expected. No dramatic exchange in the hallway, no blowing of trumpets, just emptied drawers and an email noting transition to a consulting role with immediate effect. The company's intranet scrubbed his name as if cleaning an artifact off a shelf. The speed of the reversal was almost cruel in its efficiency. In one meeting, the hierarchy that had enabled his behavior collapsed. That collapse felt like a release and like an exposure. People who had learned to be small breathed in a different rhythm. Those of us who had documented felt a complicated vindication. Documentation does not provide catharsis. Evidence is a functional instrument. It clears the way for institutions to act. HR asked me to step in as interim manager for client success. The appointment was pragmatic. Clients needed reassurance, the team required stability, and someone with institutional knowledge and a clean record was necessary. It was not a triumph, it was responsibility. The idea of leading the team that had been under his thumb did not interest me for the title. It demanded focus, rebuild processes, restore trust, and remove the incentives that had turned visibility into a currency for theft. I began with routines he had discarded as irrelevant. I reintroduced documented handoffs and mandated dual approvals for final deliverables. I formalized the feedback loop so that upward feedback reached HR without filters. I insisted that every presentation include a contributor's slide. I required that edit histories be preserved and accessible. These moves were structural, not punitive. They aimed to make the environment inhospitable to the kind of solo performance that had become his method. The initial weeks were fragile. People had learned to avoid eye contact and to calibrate their expressions to avoid attracting negative attention. My first one-on-one meetings revealed exhaustion and a map of complaints that, until then, existed only as rumor. Employees told stories of missed opportunities, of being cut out of threads, of work misattributed. They showed me old emails, version histories with deleted comments, and internal notes that suggested his patterns of appropriation were deliberate. What mattered most was not the tale of wrongdoing, but the willingness of others to speak when a structure made it possible. I enforced new norms with an even hand. When someone attempted to erase a collaborator's contribution, the metric was simple: restore credit, correct the record, and require an explanation in writing for any subsequent edits. When team members raised concerns, they received HR-mediated responses and follow-up action plans, not slogans, not culture workshops, but operational changes tied to measurable outcomes. The clients noticed. The difference between theatrical leadership and accountable leadership is visible to a customer who depends on reliability. Within a quarter, retention numbers climbed. Projects that had stagnated under performative leadership moved forward. The team began to breathe, and the breathing itself produced an output, work that could be read and verified. That is the kind of revenge that matters. Not to a person, but to a system. It replaced spectacle with sustainability. Yet I will not pretend the path was clean. The world of corporate reversal creates collateral damage. Allies of convenience moved on. Some employees left. There were legal complexities and the quiet thorn of reputational fallout. Alex's professional collapse was not cinematic, it was statutory. He contested the dismissal, he sought counsel, he filed counterclaims, and he tried to shape a narrative that framed him as a casualty of rapid cultural change. Company lawyers moved through the process with the same efficiency that had dismissed him. The public version of events favored prudence. The internal version favored a newly strengthened governance. There is a measure of poetry in the administrative closure. A person who builds themselves on performance and illusion finds those foundations unreliable when evidence enters the room. He tried to litigate the past. He attempted to reconstruct appearances at other firms, but in recruiting calls, reference checks unearthed the documented record. Auditors, once alerted, found patterns that did not fit the story he attempted to sell. The outcome was a professional exile, an ostensibly graceful exit from corporate life, and a long, quiet period of reputational calibration. My own payoff was not the demolition of a career. It was the rebuilding of work that mattered. I was made permanent manager, then later director. The title was not the revenge. It was the instrument that allowed me to change practice. I used it to embed the reforms into promotion criteria, to ensure that future aspirants could not weaponize visibility. I insisted that leadership training include ethics and verification. I wrote new language for yearly reviews that required peer-backed contributions and transparent authorship. There were smaller satisfactions that felt like the right kind of justice. A presentation once dominated by one voice now included a slide listing the team and their specific contributions. A junior analyst who had been reassigned to administrative tasks was restored to a technical lead role with a new career path. Emails that had once been redirected without notice now triggered automated logging. These are not revenge in the melodramatic sense. They are correction, small, practical, and durable. The final act of any reversal is not the fall of the perpetrator, but the construction of new expectations. Weeks turned into months. The culture normalized around accountability rather than applause. The CEO's initial unannounced presence, the man who had crouched beside me in the lot and later sat at the head of the table, became an archetype, an example of leadership that preferred observation to spectacle. He did not stage public shaming. He enforced structure. He walked the floors and watched how people behaved when the cameras were off. The company learned that leadership must look at the quiet moments and make them legible. There was a time after the dust settled when I parked in the same lot and did not flinch. I looked at the spot where the pages had scattered and felt something like an edit being made to the story of my career. A sentence removed, another inserted, now clear and readable. People asked me if I wanted him punished publicly. I told them the punishment had been institutional. He lost the platform that allowed him to perform. He had to reconstruct his identity outside the systems that had once amplified him. That is a harder road than a moment of spectacle. Revenge in a corporate setting is not an arrow loosed in anger. It is a methodical realignment of incentives and structures. I do not celebrate vindictiveness. I celebrate correction. I celebrate the reallocation of reward toward collaborative work and the protection of those who do it. The equilibrium we restored was not fragile theatrics. It was the kind of governance that makes theft harder and teamwork easier. When new hires ask me about career survival, I tell them the blunt things. Keep a record, do your work with rigor, and build alliances that are not transactional. I encourage them to record findings, not as ammunition, but as institutional memory. I teach them to see documentation as a public good. I teach them to notice how leaders behave when they think no one important is watching. The man in the suit who had handed me the folder never explained himself. He did not need to. His presence had been enough. He watched the lot and the lobby and preferred to act through the system rather than through theatrics. He made the quiet calculation that when you create structures that preserve truth, you change what people will risk. That is the architecture of accountability. Alex's professional collapse was visible enough to satisfy facts and quiet enough to avoid melodrama. News of his departure circulated in staff updates and compliance reports. He appeared at a few industry events afterward, his resume rewritten for outside consulting, but the invitations he sought did not multiply. The world that rewards performance without provenance has a memory of its own. When references are checked and audits are examined, a narrative built on misattribution does not travel far. I kept the folder for a long time. The pages were not a trophy. They were a reminder of how close a disciplined person can come to being disassembled by another's presentation. I put the folder in a locked drawer, then later in a compliance vault, and finally, I archived a clean copy in a secure place reserved for institutional memory. Evidence matters not for revenge, but for prevention. Years later, Meridian looks different. Reward structures favor team outcomes. Promotions require documented impact. Leadership reviews include upward feedback. The culture that once rewarded performance theater now celebrates reliability. The change did not come as a single event. It arrived in dozens small policies and the lived practice of managers who understood that their power resembled stewardship, not stagecraft. When I walk across the parking lot now, I do not look for strangers in dark coats. I look for the person who will open a door and stand by the work others have done. The story of those scattered papers has lodged in my behavior. I am less likely to assume silence is indifference. I file things carefully. I watch for patterns. I coach people to do the same. Revenge is not a private scene. It is an organizational correction. It is what happens when a system finally refuses to carry the weight of a performance built on other people's labor. My boss tried to make me small by staging a public humiliation. He did not foresee that someone with authority would observe, that the record would be clear, and that the company would choose structure over spectacle. The man who picked up the pages did not incite a spectacle. He came with authority and with a preference for procedure. His intervention was not a fairy tale. It was a governance decision disguised in a simple act of kindness. The result was the most efficient kind of revenge, a reconfiguration of incentives so that the kind of behavior that had been rewarded was no longer profitable. I do not seek revenge for its own sake. If there is a lesson in what happened, it is this: do the work so thoroughly that it resists being claimed by others. Build proof into processes. Teach others to value documentation. Create institutions that protect the producers from the performers. That is the only kind of revenge that endures. My name is Catherine Smith. I was humiliated in a parking lot and helped back into work by someone who preferred to use structure rather than spectacle. Karma did not arrive with thunder. It arrived with signatures and process. It replaced a man's platform with a system that measured truth rather than rhetoric. It was quiet, efficient, and durable. And in the end, it made my work visible in a way that could not be erased.